thoughtful ideas, suggestions for guests and topics.
Great events, programs, and all the
Welcome to this week's segment of Dialogue Houston. I'm your host, Lawrence Payne. To our regular viewing audience, welcome. To those joining us perhaps for the first time here for HCC's TV Dialogue Houston, we're here every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 a.m. and again at 6 p.m. and Saturday afternoons at 3 p.m. As always, at the top of the hour, let me thank you for your thoughtful emails, texts, and phone calls concerning previous shows we've aired here on HCC TV, but particularly your great ideas for topics, guests, and subjects to be covered on upcoming segments of Dialogue Houston. After all, this is your community affairs, public affairs show here proudly on HCC TV, now starting its 28th season. I want to thank you for the comments we've had from the shows we've done the last few weeks. And yes, we're going to get more deeply into those issues around social justice, around racial justice, picking up where we left off on the series, police reform. We're going to be doing more on that going forward also. But I'm so happy and proud to have as my guest today a pillar of the community in the Third Ward, particularly and at the University of Houston, a native Houstonian who really has been a person who has led the charge for things that happen in the greater Third Ward area as part of his work at the University of Houston. He's Dr. Elwyn and is the Vice President for Neighborhood and Strategic Initiatives. He's also co-chair of the Racial Equity and Social Justice Committee at the University of Houston, a household name that many of you know. So Dr. Elwyn, welcome. Great to have you here.
It's my pleasure to be on with you, really. It truly is.
Well, you just hosted and was the host and moderator of a wonderful program entitled George Floyd, Where Are We 1 year afterwards, after 1 year. And you put together a stellar panel, an outstanding panel members to respond to that question. I happen to be blessed by you to be asked to be one of those, which I thank you for. It was a great group of people along with Police Chief Finner, Troy Finner. But I really wanted you to kind of recap for our audience the main tenets of that discussion on June 9th and really tell us what was the genesis that led you to want to do this around this topic and subject. And what you saw was the main things that came out of the gathering on June 9th?
The idea of doing an assessment of where we are now was fairly easy. Lots of people are doing that. But I wanted to have a focus on what got us there in the first place. And that was the horrific murder of George Floyd. I don't want people to forget that, what sparked this right. Racial reckoning and concern and focus on social injustice and inequities and that sort of thing. And so that's what it was in part. And then when I was visualizing it, I want to structure it in a way that I saw the incident and how I saw people might flow through it. And so I started off with the idea of trauma, because when you saw the video, the first thing that occurs is you're traumatized. And I want people to think about that, because so often people want traumatized people to get over it. And they don't recognize how deep the wounds are. Often they don't feel it as deeply as we do. And they don't understand that we traumatize. There's such a thing as collective trauma. I mean, the trauma that you see, when it came, it was already building upon traumas that we've already had with Eric Garner and all the other people that we've seen. And then right after that, the trauma continues. And so you have difficulty healing. And, when you see more incidents, the scab is torn off and you have to start over again. And I remember a young undergraduate who I talked to, he said he was numb. He was numb. And then in talking to some people, they needed places to vent, needed places to dialogue. to try to heal. And I thought Dr. Walker, given her expertise, could speak to that a little bit. The other thing she touched on, as you will recall, is the prevalence of people who have mental difficulties, emotionally traumatized. And we have a lot of people, particularly in the Black community, who suffer through that. And those people often are, when engaged with the police, end up getting hurt. That's when I think about the police, I think about how traffic stops very frequently and trying to engage people who are having mental episodes often leads to tragedy. So there's a connection there as well. I thought we'd start with the trauma and then proceed to the trial, because we need some hope. There was some idea, I think, in the minds of some people that, if we could get justice in this case, maybe it would give us hopes we could get justice and accountability in the future. Because if you track the history of these kind of incidents where unarmed people are killed by police, so often they're not charged at all. There is no trial. And so often if there's a trial, they're not convicted. Some of us will remember Rodney King. I think it was the year of our Lord, 1992.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that those several officers, I don't know if it was 5 or 6, but I remember the video. And I read later that they hit him in the head 52 times. And he suffered brain damage. And I think there was a trial, but they were not convicted.
Nope.
So there was no healing in that incident, despite the fact that you had a video. So here we had a very clear video, and there was hope. People were not sure that Derek Chauvin would be convicted, despite the clear evidence that he had murdered him. And so when that occurred, the question is, well, was that justice and was that accountability? And does this mean that in the future, people might be held accountable in that way? And the answer is complicated, but I'll simplify it. The first has to do with, well, how will he be sentenced? He won't be sentenced until June 25th. But when you run through the legal things, it's not clear. And the law professor that we had on, she recognized that the sentencing guidelines for someone who had no priors say about 12.5 years, but you could be enhanced. She believes it will be enhanced, and she speculates that he might get 30 years. But with good time, it might go down to 20. Whether people feel that's justice or accountability, I'm not sure. On the question going forward, whether people will be charged and whatever, that depends on what we do, because that trial was very special. As Dr. Genova pointed out, the last forum speaker of the day on the 9th, he pointed out it took worldwide demonstrations in the minds of many to bring it to a trial.
Mm-hmm.
All of this publicity, those are fairly unique circumstances. And the other unique thing that happened, you had a series of police officers who testified against Chauvin, which is very rare.
Right.
So it gives us hope, but it doesn't necessarily mean that going forward, people will be indicted or tried. So we have work to do on the front. On the other hand, we invited Police Chief Troy Finner, who was appointed on March 18th. And I've had occasion to talk to him offline. And he brings the right attitude to that position, one that emphasizes accountability. And so I don't think we could have a better person in that position with respect to our goal to try to bring appropriate police practices. But there are structural things that limit what he can do. And one of the things I applaud your leadership in producing that magnificent, comprehensive task force report, because it goes beyond slogans like defund the police and says, well, what really can you do? And you went at it so comprehensively. It was evidence-based, and it gives one hope that with a leader like Troy Finner, that you can get perhaps a change in the culture because of the many recommendations that you made, several of which the mayor embraced, and he put money behind many things. You mentioned some of your principles. I don't recall all of them, but I know one of them was transparency. There's a lot in there about having information available and collecting data so people will know. Accountability all throughout the training process, and collecting data so you can hold people or train them. And I know we talk about recruiting, getting the right people there in the first place. And that helps build culture. The more people who actually model the values that the chief has and that the force has, the easier it is to change the culture. So I feel good about that, but still I know there are complications. One of them is the civil service system that allows certain kinds of appeal. So police chiefs can fire, then it gets taken out of their hand, and so often they get overturned. And when I say so often, I mean in Houston.
Right.
And in Houston. And then the other thing, even if you fire someone, that they can go down the road. I think they mentioned during the forum 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the country, with different policies and rules and standards. And then in this area, I don't know how many, 25?
89
Oh my
different law
goodness,
enforcement
89.
in Greater Harris County.
We have seen situations where someone who killed an unarmed Black person literally got fired and is stuck. And then they moved to another law enforcement in the area and were applauded when they walked through the door.
Yeah.
So there are challenges, and that's where we, the people, lifting our voices, using information that we have, can make a big difference. I'm more hopeful about Houston than I'm about the country as a whole, but I will note that over 30 cities they're engaging in reformation and proposals, and dozens of the 30 states, I'm sorry, in dozens of cities. So there's a lot going on. So that gives one hope.
Right.
And some of the proposals that were in the state legislature that people who really care about this said would have been negative and deleterious, apparently they didn't get passed. So there weren't new obstacles put into place.
Let me pick up on some of the things you've touched on, because I think you really laid it out really well. In the case of now having Chief Troy Finner as the police chief of Houston, I can say personally, after working with him, it's a blessing to have him here and at this particular time in history. The right person, the right time, along with Mayor Turner's commitment to the implementation of the task force report's recommendations, we've made great strides. Let me just point out 2 or 3 things that you touched on, because I think they're so important. Starting with the psychological impact. I think because we're coming out of post-COVID-19 world and post-George Floyd reality, those 2 stressful events on top of each other has really, as you said, left a lot of stress and trauma, a lot of fear and anxiety in human beings. And then you put this whole police reform on top of that layer of those 2 incidents. What we've come to realize in the area of police reform, that police reform is truly society's reform. Police reform is society's reform. We've dumped all this stuff on police departments that we did not want to deal with as a society, as a nation, as a people, that never should have been put there. The mental health issues, the issue of poverty, education, all those things we've been wrestling with as a society of what to do in fair, ethical treatment to other human beings, inequities and inequalities. Since we didn't know what to do, or we didn't have the will to do what should have been done, we dumped it on the police department. It never was trained to do all of that. So that's becoming very clear. The second point is that, as you mentioned in the Derek Chauvin trial, the first time a police chief, first time in history, a sitting police chief and fellow officers testified against one of their own. That's significant going forward. We hope that starts a new norm, a new trend, and just wasn't a one-off kind of thing going forward. The other thing I have to touch on is the piece that you mentioned about, I refer to it now as the 5-legged stool of doing police reform in this country. Transparency, accountability, communication, relationships, and trust. The last one being the number one pillar. Nothing happens without trust. Nothing happens without trust. No one does anything to, for, or with another human being that they do not trust. So we find ourselves in this point of departure where police reform is the intersection of culture, politics, and the media. And because those three are at play, how we begin to talk about the status quo and the status quo not being acceptable anymore becomes this reality, particularly when you add demographics on top of it. And you and I have talked about this offline once the other day. We're kind of in this in-between time. The old order is dying and the new order is trying to be born. And when you're in this in-between time, it's very uncomfortable for everyone, for the liberals and the conservatives, for the Republicans and Democrats. And then you add that the country split 50-50 divide. It's understandable why dialogue and communication going forward is going to be the key. That's why having forums that you put on this recently, along with others that we need to plan going forward, as you said, as you ended your comments just a minute ago, it is in the ongoing future conversations and dialogue that will give us hope, not a false hope, a hope that we can really build on, that things are going to change because they have to change. We can't go on in society the way we've been doing it.
That's true. That's true. You know, Black people have been very patient if we look back on history, you know, steady in our desire to be treated as equals, steady in our desire to be seen as human beings, trying to prove that we are worthy of that, even though it shouldn't have been a question. So we fought in all the wars, done all those things. And it's disheartening to see what happened to George Floyd, and the thought being that could be me, that could be my brother, that could be my son, you know. But there is cause for hope. There were studies done about people's attitudes, and in the aftermath of George Floyd, there have been some shifts in their attitude. And I think the Kinder report, which, you know, they do the survey every year,
Right. Yeah,
and they've been doing it for 40 years. And the most recent one, and I'm gonna quote from it, it says that the Kinder report shows a striking uptick among white and Hispanic residents in their acknowledgement of racial injustice and the discrimination that Black Americans face. And and there are other surveys that show other kinds of shifts,
right,
or in that way. And that gives us some hope too, that people will actually be willing to engage in conversations and grapple with the real issues that are affecting people.
Let me ask you, I don't want to cut you, but let me ask you this. Since we're approaching Juneteenth, the legacy of slavery that is still with us, and you touched on that a minute ago, going back to our Constitution when Black people were understood to be only 3/5 of a person in our own Constitution. The ability of what Derek Slaveman was able to do to George Floyd struck me as one of those moments where I'm using this terminology on purpose, the subhuman, the less than human person under his knee gave him the ability to treat that human being the way he did, because he did not see him as a full human being. That's that vestige and legacy of slavery. That's
Yes,
that being 3/5 of only a human being enlisted in the Constitution. I think that still carries over to today, the way many people see and understand Black people.
I have wondered aloud, how can someone do something like that? How could even going back to the Jim Crow era in the early 1900s in Tulsa, and those when they were lynching people on a regular basis, how could people come to these lynching events where they were burning and torturing and mutilating a man and treat it like a picnic?
With their children. With their children.
And children. And essentially it was like going to a barbecue. This was not a human being like I am. This is something else. That's the only way you could understand it.
Right.
And even when I say that, I said the level of barbarism is so great. I said, I wonder if you'd even do that to an animal. You know, I mean, it has really been something. I think people need to think about that. And it wasn't that long ago, when you think about it, that these things were going on. And we keep getting reminders and keep getting victimized. You remember I think it's the James Byrd lynching?
Oh, yes, yes, right down the road, right down the road.
In East Texas. I don't remember what year that was, but I mean, the
Not too
idea.
long ago. Not too long
Yeah,
ago.
I mean,
Jazz,
put a chain
Jasper,
around a
Texas.
man. I think they dragged him around the truck till his head separated. This is
Right.
barbarism. I was studying some history about Hitler and the Third Reich, and I found out when they were trying to design a system where they could discriminate against a group and keep them at a lower caste, and they sent people over to the United States to study the laws in the South. And because they were German, they kept copious notes.
Right.
So you can read what they were thinking. And I was reading the notes from one of the meetings, and they said, we're reading some of the laws in Alabama and Mississippi. And that one of the officers said, "Oh no, we can't go that far." Seriously.
Yeah.
Seriously. Oh no, we can't go that far.
Right.
And it really hits you how bad and how, it's just too much. And yet we've always been willing to extend the hand of peace and to go forward with people who will join us to make this country a more perfect union. And I hope we don't run out of that patience, but my goodness, what we have to forgive or not let stop us is really horrendous. When those 9 people got murdered in South Carolina, when somebody wanted to do something so horrendous, they wanted to start a race war.
Right.
And folks said, we forgive him. My goodness.
The minutes we have left, let me ask you this, because Dr. King hit it on the head with his phrase, we can either have chaos or community. And we're at that point now, I think, clearly in our history, in this point in time in this country. We're going to have to figure out which one we want. And I think we're going to have to do it in a way that people like you and I and others on both sides of the aisle who understand what's happening, we have to get those individuals, human beings together to figure out what's the plan going forward. Okay, we understand our history. The history informs the present, so we can have a brighter and better future together tomorrow, collective future together. So let's take all that in consideration. What's going on in Texas with voter suppression, we're wanting to rewrite history vis-a-vis the Alamo and vis-a-vis slavery. The phrase they're using now is to whitewash history and only present the white version of history and not the actual things of slavery and everything else, atrocities that happened. It's part of that movement. So we need to counter those things in a way that allows the humanity and the civility to rise to the occasion again so that we can have fruitful, productive conversations and dialogue. Your thoughts in the few minutes we have left of how we may achieve some of that?
Well, I think we do have to seize the moment to create conversations perhaps where we are, in the universities, in the corporate offices, in the places where people already are, and have them continue. My great fear is that people will say, okay, George Floyd, the guy got convicted, we're done, let's move on. And so it's up to people who recognize that what you said is really true, not just in this country, but if you look at the world, we're at the same inflection point. We're either gonna have chaos or we're gonna have community that addresses global warming and all the challenges that's going on in the world. And so we really are at a real inflection point in that respect. Unfortunately, it looks like a certain segment of the population is just arming itself to the teeth. And that's really, I don't even have the adjective for it, I don't have the adjective for it. So I think with the fact that people are more sensitized, more willing to appreciate the suffering and the pain that particularly Black people have gone through, my hope is that they're more willing to listen and to learn. And I had a very wonderful Anglo staff member here, call me and say, well, Dr. Lee, is there some place where I can go to learn? And then after I've learned, where I can dialogue with people where they won't make fun of me because of my ignorance, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was a great attitude and a great
Mm-hmm.
question.
Mm-hmm.
And so we put together a list of materials that she could read, things like see the movie The 13th on Netflix, and 14th,
Mm-hmm.
and the new Jim Crow, that book. But then there needs to be a place where people can talk honestly and ask questions without being ridiculed. And we're going to try to create a place like that at our university where that
Wonderful.
can happen.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. Listen, we're out of time here, or we'll be in about a few seconds. Let me just wrap up and say thank you for being our guest on Dialogue Houston. As always, it's great to dialogue and have a conversation with you. We will continue to do so, hopefully on a regular basis, with some of the initiatives and other things that you're working on in the community. And I'll just kind of wrap up this way. We have a golden opportunity to really make significant change now, systemic change, eradication. But I think it's going to take a real shift in our mindset. We have been so reliant and dependent on charity, which is a wonderful thing, and service. And that's the downstream kind of response to issues that we see around us of poverty, inequities, and inequalities. We're going to have to give some serious thought to doing some upstream thinking and trying to begin to do justice and social justice around eradication and systemic change of the issues through policy change primarily. Because we can't go on and just approach it from a charity standpoint. It's not an either-or conversation, it's a both and. Charity is the short-term way to address these issues. Justice is the long-term way to address issues. And we have not really wanted to do that. I think it begs now in 2021 going forward. City of Houston will be 200 years in a short period of time. We'll celebrate our bicentennial. To begin to ask the questions, what kind of city do we want to live in? What kind of future do we want to have? And take the long view of history, not only for the recognition of the work that our heroes and sheroes have done, the past generations, not only for the now walking, talking current generations, but for those yet waiting to be born. And what kind of Houston do we want to bring them into? And I think it starts with some basic questions. And that is number one is the aspirational goal. What is the fair and ethical treatment of all human beings? What is the fair, moral, and ethical treatment of all human beings? What does that baseline look like? What is that assurance of a baseline that all human beings deserve the following things for dignity, for comfort, for safety, etc.? We've never talked about that. We've allowed the economy to drive that discussion. Well, we know that doesn't work anymore. We know that minimum wage jobs will not get you there. Working part-time for minimum wage job was always meant to be for a student, for a college, for a high school student, a college student, or a retired person, not for a family to sustain themselves off that paycheck. You cannot do it. Even if you work full-time for minimum wage, you cannot sustain a family. So we have a lot of serious questions to ask ourselves. It really starts with democracy, and what does democracy mean in a multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-dimensional community that is wrestling still with diversity and trying to move into pluralism to understand how we live together in a pluralistic society. All those things are at play. And it seems to me the deep thought thinking that needs to occur, people can do that. We know who those people are. We need to bring them together. So as I end this segment, as I always do, with great optimism and great hope, and hope, remember, is not a state of mind, it's a state of action, and not a wish, it's not a prayer, it's a state of action. We continue to do that in our ongoing way here on Dialogue Houston. We look forward to you joining us in upcoming segments of Dialogue Houston. And until then, as always, stay well, be safe, peace, power, and love.